Joining me now is Cornell Belcher. He's an MS Now political analyst. He served as pollster for both Obama campaigns and is the president of the polling firm Brilliant Corners Research and Strategies. And G. Elliott Morris is a longtime data journalist and the author of the book Strength in Numbers: How Polls Work, Why We Need Them, and a Substack of the same name. Thanks to both of you for being with us. Elliott, let me start with you. What's your take on, I mean, these are marginal shifts in a political report. But for a lot of Democrats, this puts meat on the bones that they were thinking about.
Well, look, I came prepared. I did bring my trusty old calculator for you, Velshi. I figured it's
like
Saturday.
That.
So let's have some fun. Look, the Cook Political Report is great, good ratings analyst. But one common factor with these ratings is that they're a little lagging. The race raters take some time to update the race ratings based on the ground sentiment. And so what I have found cycle after cycle is that as things move in one direction, the race raters take a couple of months to really pick up on those changes. And over the last couple of months, there's been, of course, a lot of changes in the national political environment that make things look more democratic. So I think these adjustments they're making are a signal that the trend we're seeing in American politics is just towards the Democrats, and that makes the Senate opportunity pretty bullish for them. They should have a pretty good chance of taking back the Senate, which, it's not, maybe if it's 50-50, is still a big improvement over where we were at this point probably a year ago.
And in all of these races, Cornell, they're for slightly different reasons. So there's the overall dissatisfaction with Donald Trump on immigration, on the economy, on the war in Iran, on trustworthiness, on, as Elliott points out in his column, on intelligence of Donald Trump. Only 67% of people think he's intelligent, strangely. But there are specific things, like in North Carolina, it's got a lot to do with Roy Cooper. In Georgia, it's got a lot to do with the mess that the Republicans are in nominating a candidate, not getting Brian Kemp to run for governor. In Texas, it's a royal mess. I mean, Paxton and Cornyn are wrecking each other in this race, while Tallarico is just minding his own business, garnering votes. They're all a little bit different.
No, they are all different. And look, in every race in these states are going to break along the dynamics that are happening around those candidates in those states. But to that point, look, I think you have to give the Senate Leader Schumer and his people kudos, because candidate recruitment really counts. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the quality of candidates that Democrats have been able to land in these seats, they've done a really good job from North Carolina to Ohio to, quite frankly, even Alaska, and even in Nebraska, where it moves marginally towards the Democrats. What that means from a campaign perspective, Ali, is that Republicans now have to think about defending more seats now than they certainly were thinking about a year or so ago. And so the cash and the infrastructure and the resources that they have to expand across the battleground map. And again, look, we keep talking about Texas, but with the amount of money that Tallarico has been able to raise, and again, a solid candidate that sort of seems to fit that state very well, Republicans have to now defend a lot more states than I think they thought they would have a year ago, and that certainly benefits Democrats.
Yeah, Sean Harris from Georgia 14 made this point the other day that Republicans had to spend $3 million, Elliott, to defend a ruby red district. That's $3 million that's not being spent somewhere else. Elliott, you wrote something on April 17th in which you said the president's job approval in our current era of high polarization has become less a signal of presidential performance and more a signal of partisan identity. Most Republicans are not willing to tell a pollster they disapprove of the president unless he does something truly beyond the pale, but they can express their concerns in other ways. I don't know what counts as truly beyond the pale for you. The fight with the Pope, the swearing on Easter, the war that nobody seems to understand we started. What in your opinion, is beyond the pale?
Look, I think the real thing to focus on here is that Donald Trump every day is reminding the American people why they have a negative opinion of him on average, right? The approval rating for the president is in the basement. It's -20 among all adults. If you just look at registered voters, maybe it's -15. look, that means that opinion of the president has shifted 17 percentage points among registered voters since 2024. And if you ask Republicans how they feel, not about the job he's doing as president, but how they feel about his tweets, about the Pope, about annihilating a civilization in Iran, or just how he approaches his presidency in general, his rhetoric and his conduct as president, you get a lot of soft approval and you get more soft disapproval with those Republican voters not really being on board with like Trump the man, even if they will tell a pollster they like what he's doing as president. And of course, he's not running as president in the midterm, but as your quotes from these Republicans underscore, most of the press coverage that is about the Republican Party is about Donald Trump, and that shapes voters' perceptions of him. And that's going to give the Republicans a really hard uphill climb to hold the House. I think they probably won't do it. I'd put that at like a 95% chance. And it means they're going to have a tough time in these close toss-up Senate races as well.
So, Cornell, on April 12th, you said if you're a Republican running for anything in 2026, it's time to hit the panic button. That was a long time before a lot of the tomfoolery that we've seen in recent weeks. In fact, this morning, Donald Trump had a press conference, and I don't want to diminish, I don't know anything about psychedelics and how they work, and I don't want to diminish the importance of that, but it's not anything that the nation needed to hear from the president this morning. They needed to hear about either Iran or oil prices or affordability or something else. But this is what Donald Trump does. Some Republicans, I think they might just be happier if he just didn't speak.
Well, look, the problem for Republicans is that midterms are usually tend to be focused on the president, right? And it's in polling that we see right now, the best testing messages have to do with putting a check on Donald Trump. It's a referendum on Donald Trump, right? And that's particularly problematic for Republicans right now when his numbers have collapsed on every measure, right? And Ali, look, I've been doing this a while, and I've seen presidents' numbers go up and down and move around, but I've never seen this sort of collapse, and particularly under the water, when you look at the structure of his collapse, it's on everything you want to measure, whether it be about the economy, whether it be about inflation, whether it be about values. It's such a complete and utter collapse. And at this point, typically, I've seen this with Democrats in the past, like Democrats want to give themselves some space from the top of the ticket, right? It is impossible for Republicans right now to
give
break
themselves
and
space.
move away from the president, and the president dominates every news cycle in a way that it's all focused on him. So the idea of this is going to be a referendum on the president, I think at some point Republicans are going to have to try to push him off the stage, but it's so tough because of his base. And if his base isn't energized, it becomes problematic. But if this is a referendum on Donald Trump, which looks like it's going to be, I think it's time for them to hit the panic button, because they're going to see some serious losses.
So, Elliot, I want to lean into your calculator again. With the bottom of the screen, it says the poll, Trump approval rating sits at 38%. That's an Economist YouGov poll. That's probably the one that's most favorable to Donald Trump. It puts his approval at about 57%, and disapproval at 57%. That's lower than some. But basically, it's a 60-40 or 65-35 thing, right? All the polls put his approval at about 35. He doesn't seem to go lower than that. It doesn't actually matter if he fights with the Pope or starts a war or oil prices are $120 a barrel. Nothing seems to budge that. What does that tell you? Why is that important that he seems to be at his bottom? I don't know, because I'm not a pollster and I'm not a data expert, but that seems to be, he seems to hit a bottom in the low 30s.
Well, look, Ali, there's a lot of polarization in American politics today. There's polarization on issue preferences, like what you want the government to do. But more importantly, there's polarization on how you feel about the other side. There's this affective polarization. Really, a lot of Americans just hate the other side of the aisle. And the math here is there's a lot of Republicans out there who want to stick by their man, and they would never vote for a Democrat. You ask policy preferences. What do you think about the war in Iran? What do you think about rolling back funding for the Affordable Care Act, et cetera? You get about 30% of people saying they approve of Donald Trump's actions on that. And that's just the reality. But look, that 30% of Americans are not deciding elections. If we're thinking about electoral stakes here, the real voters are those people in the middle that either flip-flop or refuse to vote if they don't want to vote for Trump the man who has really soft approval metrics on the things that count from a personality metric. So yeah, maybe you could tell me, there's just 30% of voters who just love the guy. But look, that's only 30%.
And in your opinion, Cornell, what do Democrats have to do to keep this momentum going for them? Or what do they not have to do to break it?
Well, look, I want to underline this point, like even more so than the metrics of looking at polls, and look, we're pollsters, and I love looking at polls. But look at the trend line of reality. Mm-hmm. In reality, in every election that we've had since Donald Trump's been in office, Democrats have won or overperformed by double digits. And if that trend continues, Ali, in real life, what you see is there's an awful lot of congressional districts where Republicans sit in that they don't have a plus 20-point advantage. And if you look at their attempts to rig the system, what they've done is they've loosened up Republican voters and spread them out across more districts and potentially made more congressional seats targetable. And you can see that with the Democrats and the House Democrats expanding the map where they're looking to target seats. Look, typically, the elections are really determined in maybe 20 seats, right? Because of all gerrymandering and how incumbents do. I think that's going to be much broader this year, 40, maybe even 50 seats where there's real competition for those seats. I think Democrats have to continue to lean into the conversations that are focused on Americans about affordability, but also, Ali, I want to say this really quickly. It's not just affordability. And look, you've seen it on your show where you've talked to people who've never protested before. Yep. And they come out and they protest because of what they're seeing happening in this country around ICE and people's rights. And that you cannot measure. So it's not simply the affordability. It's also a culture of corruption and a values question for so many Americans.
I fully agree with that. And that's why I was having a conversation with Ann Applebaum earlier about Hungary, because Peter Magyar in Hungary was able to find that intersection between corruption and oligarchy and your life and your costs of things. And if people can do that this time, that might be interesting. Guys, thanks so much. What a fantastic conversation. Cornell Belcher is MS Now political analyst and former pollster for both Obama campaigns. G. Elliott Morris is a longtime data-driven journalist with an excellent retro calculator.